Today, I want to talk a little bit about Mass Effect, specifically the next game, and where it seems to be in development, some guesses and speculation we can make based on almost no information. On that point, let me be very clear. If you're not here for speculation and discussion about a game that is 3 or 4 years away, that may never come out, that may be in complete turmoil, but hopefully isn't, I would check out because this video isn't probably for you. If you are willing to hear some discussion about these topics, almost all of it speculative with a little bit of information behind it, then let's jump into it. Okay, so the way I'm going to do this is we're basically going to go back and look at some of the bits of information and the events that have come out over the last few months. I'm going to start with 2024's N7 Day. If you want to see my recap of everything we've gotten about Mass Effect so far, the next game, and kind of what's going on with BioWare, I'll try to remember to put a link to one of my videos down there, but you can search my my YouTube channel for everything we know, and that should pull up probably a couple of videos. I would watch the most recent one. Kicking off with N7 Day 2024, this was notable because it was almost entirely uneventful. They had just recently released Dragon Age the Veilguard, and this is what they gave us, as opposed to what had been more common in previous years, of them showing at least like a little concept art or a little trailer or something like that. We effectively got nothing. If you were really digging deep, like I definitely do, we did get some cosmetics in Dragon Age the Veilguard, and I think there was a little bit to take from that. I have a whole video on that if you want to look for it, but it wasn't anything significant. At this time, it was basically just them doing the whole, yep, we're working on it, and we'll give you more info later. Now, what we know in hindsight is that around this time, they probably were just getting back to doing pre-production on Mass Effect, on the next game. 4, 5, next, whatever, I don't care. That discussion is entirely boring and tired to me. I'll call it next. And what we found out in the time since is that there was about a year gap from around the time of the launch of Dragon Age the Veilguard, back about a year, if not a bit more, where pre-production on the next Mass Effect game was stopped. It could have been up to a year and a half. And what that means is that all of the directors, which if you want some good news about the next game, the next Mass Effect game has a set of 6 or 7 directors on the game. And as far as I know, they've all been set in stone for 2 or 3 years at this point, if not longer. Mary DeMarley and Mike Gamble and so on. So the impression is that all of those people in some capacity, and anyone else who was on the pre-production team, which it seems like there was a handful of other people also on the team, were all working on Veilguard to get that out. If you look at Veilguard's credits, you'll see all of these people in there. It's not a bad way to see who's on the Mass Effect team right now and who's working on pre-production, because it's a good list there. And as far as I know, none of those people are gone, even though that could be not true by now. And there is actually one person who I know was working on Mass Effect who wasn't on that list because they were listed as a more permanent dev on Veilguard, which I didn't know that. So N7 Day, extremely quiet. They warned us of this. They made it pretty clear. Hey, it's going to be kind of quiet this year. We just released a game. The focus is on that. And now we know in hindsight, they really hadn't had any time to work on anything interesting to show anyways. So from there, about a month later, we had Dragon Age Day. This was obviously focused on Dragon Age. Very, I think that should be assumed, but it was still an update from BioWare, and we went from there. Now, what happened in kind of, I want to say it was late January of 2025 this year, is Mark Dara started putting out some videos and doing some stuff. And he put out what ended up being kind of an interesting video of saying, I think they may focus on one game at BioWare rather than trying to do this code development thing that obviously isn't working for them. Again, we now know in hindsight that they weren't really co-developing two games for the last year and a half or 2 years. They were just working on Veilguard because they just don't have a big enough team, right? And and he kind of was prophetic. Now, Mark Dara is a former BioWare director and head honcho, or at least a higher up person there, who never really left. He seems like he's been acting more as a consultant in recent years, especially on Veilguard. Seems like he legitimately is gone from there now, whatever that means. I wouldn't be surprised if we see him back. So I assume when he was making some of these statements about how they may, focus more and things like that, he was kind of the canary in the coal mine a bit for the next thing that we'll talk about. But it was interesting that, the spin on it, at least at the time, and it is what I gathered as well from his videos, was that this is probably a good thing. The time when they were working on 4 or 5 different games. If you watch Mark Dara's, the history of BioWare video that he recently put out, where he talks about everything that BioWare was doing from the start to now, even though the now is extremely minimal, you'll know that they were working on 4 or 5 games at a time in their history. And back then that was still crazy, but it was more realistic because scope was smaller, tech was simpler. There was just a lot of things that made that more reasonable to do. And nowadays you just can't do that. Like the only studios I know of that are really doing that at a high level are like Ubisoft Massive, but that's because like they've recently put out Star Wars Outlaws and the Avatar game as they continue working on some of their old titles. That's because that Avatar team was a different studio that got brought into their studio. So that they effectively have 2 studios plus a bunch of smaller teams in their studio. BioWare doesn't have that. As far as we know right now, they may have as few as, a couple hundred devs. And that's, as we'll talk about here in a moment, recently got smaller, right? So I will say, and I took the same perspective on Dara's video, that it seems like a hopeful situation because if they can put all their resources and all of their people into one thing, that prevents issues with miscommunications and people being shared with other teams and so on and so forth. And then shortly after that, at the end of January, we got this studio update. I've kind of joked, even though it's not really that funny in hindsight, that if you get a blog from like Mike Gamble or a developer or something, it's probably going to be a cool blog. If you get a blog from Gary McKay, it could be okay. It's probably not. And what was interesting about this blog is this is where they talk about, they confirm that the Mass Effect game is their next game. They also led to, kind of talked about how, development on Dragon Age, the Veilguard has wrapped. And unfortunately, doing all the corpo speak, that they were making things more efficient. Therefore, they were laying off some people. Now, the interesting thing about this blog, as opposed to previous ones or recent statements from other developers and studios and publishers, is that we knew in the lead up to this, and I think I made videos about it, that there were individuals, that there were developers that had been loaned out to other teams, EA Motive, which is another Canadian studio, as well as believe Dice and Ripple Effect and some other studios kind of in the, as well as the Skate Studio. I can't remember what they're called. And the impression is that this was temporary, and even the devs and people I talked to on the side were like, "Yeah, I'm just here until they're ready for us at BioWare on Mass Effect." And then this blog came out, and as far as I know, this blog was the announcement to many of those people, and I assume they were contacted that day or shortly after as well. Of, oh, by the way, that's permanent. You're there. That's like where you work now. And it was this weird vibe because like it wasn't layoffs, it wasn't people being kicked to the curb. They still had jobs, but it was with projects maybe they didn't care about or didn't at least think they were going to be with for very long. I know at least a couple devs who applied at and went to BioWare to work on Mass Effect, who are now on other teams working on other games. And the general vibe I've gotten both publicly and privately is that these people they're thankful that they have jobs, right? But there is still, a lot of disappointment and like sadness. they worked on a team for at least a few years on Veilguard, or even on Mass Effect, and now they're not with that team anymore. Like, you get connections and friendships and stuff like that, and that gets thrown out, especially when the initial impression, the initial statement from EA and BioWare was that it was a temporary loan to these other studios, and then it was made permanent. We also had effectively all of the writing staff at BioWare let go. I don't know if there's been much commentary on this from those individuals. There may be NDAs and stuff where they can't talk about it. I would be surprised if they were just straight up let go. But my assumption is that whatever the idea was for them from EA/BioWare, they just didn't want to do it. So whether it's being loaned out to another studio or moving to another studio entirely, or something else, that they likely denied that and decided to leave, or they were just laid off. I don't know if there's been any statements on that. Either way, it sucks, right? And so what was interesting about this blog is that the optimist can look at this and be like, hey, this is BioWare. This is the head of BioWare, the general manager, confirming that we are working on the next Mass Effect. Here's these people, these veteran developers at the studio that supposedly don't exist, who are going to be working on it from the original trilogy. And that's a cool thing, right? But then it obviously comes with the baggage of finding out that there's a bunch of people leaving and being let go against their will, right? There was also the whole thing of, this kind of recognition that, that BioWare's not this 500-600 head studio anymore. And it came out in kind of subsequent reporting that there's a pretty good chance that BioWare's down to like 100 devs or 100 people, or maybe as low as that, maybe a little bit more, maybe even less. And that has led me to believe, especially after seeing some of the way that they've been marketing the next Battlefield game, which some of the BioWare devs are now working on, or former BioWare devs. I think that we will eventually find out that the next Mass Effect game won't be completely developed by BioWare developers. I would almost guarantee we're going to have a co-dev situation where there's going to be like EA Motive and maybe 2 or 3 other studios who are all going to be working on this one project. There has been some impression, both publicly and privately told to me, that there is a thought of, these devs that were let go or sent to other studios, that there was an impression that when we begin full-scale development, you'll have the ability to basically request or apply to come back to BioWare to work on these games. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So this was obviously a huge bummer. Obviously, everyone freaked out and was losing their minds. My, I guess, optimistic take on this was there's been every opportunity for EA to shut down BioWare for the last 10 years, and they haven't. They've continued even after the disasters, either financially or from a review perspective, critically. After Andromeda and after Anthem, obviously the Mass Effect Legendary Edition was probably a high point in a way where they didn't do that much work on it, and it probably sold a ton of copies, it seems like. And then the Veilguard comes out, and that's at least been a mixed reception. I'm much higher on it than others are, but that's the way that goes. And now we have this situation where now they're working on another Mass Effect game, and we're having all these layoffs and people leaving, and at any point they could have just been shut down. So my take on this has been EA/BioWare, for better or worse, people are doing things to try to keep this going. Maybe it's a long road to nothing, and we'll have to wait and find that out over the next few years. I'm going to hope for the best with that. I'm not going to be as doomer about it as some others have been, but I also understand why people have been. There was a bit of a bright light here at the beginning of February when Mike Gamble, who's the, if you look here, he is the executive producer, project director of the next Mass Effect game. And he posted this. Well, that was the single coolest meeting I've had in years. Thanks, Mary. You can see me gooning underneath. This is cool because he's referencing Gary DeMarley, or Mary DeMarley, who comes from Eidos, I believe it's Eidos Montreal, before they were shut down by Square. I believe it was Square Enix. And her most recent project was the Guardians of the Galaxy game. In many aspects, at least in the writing and the characters and the story, The Guardians of the Galaxy game that came out, gosh, 3 or 4 years ago now, is the closest thing to a Mass Effect game I think we've had since Mass Effect 3. I would argue it's more of a Mass Effect game than Andromeda was. That might be a hot take. I'll let you decide. She also was on the last couple more modern Deus Ex games as well, which there's a bit of a mixed reception on those, but for her part, it sounds like it was pretty well received and liked. And so it makes me super excited that she's on this project. And then something like this, and I will say that this was reiterated by a handful of other people. Some who I knew were on the Mass Effect pre-production team, some who I didn't. Were a bunch of people retweeted this or liked it, suggesting that there was, I assume, a big all hands meeting with the team that's working on the next Mass Effect. I assume where Mary and her team, whoever else is left on the writing staff, maybe we don't know about some people who are there, who have been hired and aren't active in social media. Um, it sounds like they must have had some big meeting where they, I would assume or speculate, went over some big points and what they're thinking for the narrative for the next game and things like that. I'm not going to pretend like I know more about development than I do, but I have to imagine that they go into it with a pretty solid, timeline and idea of what the story's going to do, and then flesh it out as they go to a point. So whatever this was, Mike Gamble and a bunch of other people seemed really excited about it. And then just in the last couple of days, this person here who was on the Veilguard development team announced about a month ago they were one of the people who was let go. Is posting this here saying that it's officially their last day at BioWare, but they have this weird feeling they'll be back. I have reached out and I'm under the impression that there isn't any actual, not to this person necessarily, but in general, I'm not aware that there's any news or anything happening in the background. But this kind of goes on to what I said before, where the general impression I've gotten from people is that once they begin actual full production, I assume this year, on the next Mass Effect game, they're likely going to be bringing back a lot of familiar faces. And that's 15-ish minutes of me talking about what's been going on for the last 6 months or so, with BioWare, with Mass Effect, kind of where they stand. Obviously, there's a lot of turmoil right now, at least in the view of some people, about the fallout of Dragon Age the Veilguard, where some people are kind of doom and gloom about it, making it seem like it's a complete failure. Doesn't really seem like it is. Seems like EA may have just had expectations that were a bit high for it. It also seems like Veilguard got thrown under the bus a bit to cover up the failings of FC 25, the EA soccer game, which used to be called FIFA, which seems like it struggled really bad. And at least at one point, FIFA was accounted for half of EA's revenue. And so if it had a bad year, something tells me that was much more impactful on EA in their last quarter of revenue than Veilguard was. But FC is gonna keep coming out every year, and we probably won't hear from Dragon Age for a while. So they, found the scapegoat there, I think, to a point. But there's a lot of doom and gloom out there. I get it to a point. I completely understand it from the developers and even the gamers to a point. I appreciate that there may not be a ton of optimism right now, but I am. I still am. There's a lot of things that are happening or have happened that I hate the idea of just being like, well, they aren't shutting down, so as being the good news, but it is, even if it's not as great as we would want it to be. I still think this year is going to be pretty eventful for anyone who's paying attention to Mass Effect and the development of that next game. I still think that they're going to enter full production on it this year. I assume they'll make at least a somewhat big deal out of that. They did for Dragon Age the Veilguard, and we are on a similar timeline, I would imagine, that they were on for that game. And that's not accounting for the entirety of Veilguard's development. I'm not counting the previous iterations of the game. I'm essentially noting about how they announced full production in 2020. The game came out in 2024. I'm expecting a similar timeline, if not a slightly accelerated one for the next Mass Effect. I suspect EA is putting a lot of pressure on Mass Effect and BioWare for that game to come out expediently. And I hope they get all the time they need. It seems like Veilguard did, to a point where it was a very solid game with very few bugs and issues like that. Obviously, some of the issues people had, I think, were baked in, but that's a whole different video probably. So that's what I have for where we're at. That's kind of what I've been paying attention to. If there's anything I missed, please leave it in the comments. I'd be curious, and I can add that to another video. I'll be looking out for, Summer Game Fest and all the things this summer. I imagine, like I said, we'll get some more blogs as they enter full production. I assume we'll get something for N7 Day this year that's a bit more significant than last year, and we'll just have to wait and see. So, if you like Mass Effect and you want to keep up with news for the next game and everything else that's going on, please subscribe to this channel. I also do other gaming news, so be around for that. Hit the like button if you want more people to see this, so we can get more people talking about this kind of thing. And if you really want to support, please consider becoming a YouTube member, where you get videos like this one a couple days early and a few other perks. If you want to check out my other content or other ways to support what I do, including podcast and merch and all of that stuff, check out the links in the video description. That is all I have for this one. So until next time.